Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our Chat with a Diplomat webinar. I'm excited to have the opportunity to speak with our amazing panelists and hear answers from all of the attendees' questions that have been submitted and will be asked. Now, although today we are meeting virtually, I know many of you, and myself included, are based in Australia. So before I begin, I like to make an acknowledgement of country. We respect and honour Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past, present and future. I'd like to acknowledge all of the traditional custodians of the land in Australia. We acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of this land and commit to building a brighter future together. So for those of you that don't know me, I'll be your moderator today. My name is Emma Fabreguette. I'm currently studying a master's in counterterrorism and cybersecurity. Today, I'm representing as the Sydney director of the Young Diplomats Society, who's had the honour to partner with the US Consulate of Sydney today. I'm also the senior host of the Global Questions podcast and a Sydney US Consulate Youth Advisor. Not long ago, I actually had the honor of interviewing the US Consul General Sharon Hudson-Dean for our podcast, which you can all listen to. So yeah, pretty much from what I've told you, you can tell that I'm passionate about international affairs and politics, as I'm sure many of you here today are as well, and could not be more excited for our chat today with our panelists, Meghan Higgins and Donald Maynard. Before I introduce you to our panelists, I'll tell you a little bit more about what we will be discussing today. So A Chat with a Diplomat is an initiative by the United States Consulate General of Sydney to connect young people in Australia with senior American diplomats. Designed as an open dialogue between American diplomats in Australia, which is driven by the interests of the group. A Chat with a Diplomat is a frank conversation on the relationship between Australia and the United States on US foreign policy and American culture. Today we are joined by the Ben Franklin Club, which is a youth networking group for students and young people interested in US politics and affairs. And it's also supported by the US Consulate General of Sydney. And we also have the Young Diplomats Society, which is a student-run non-for-profit organization based in Melbourne and Sydney, passionate about empowering and engaging young professionals through providing a forum for their contributions and perspectives on international relations. So before we start, just some general housekeeping. Everyone is automatically put on mute. We will first go through some pre-submitted questions by the audience before turning over to you and asking questions live. If you do have any questions and want to raise your hand, we'll call on you, or you can type it into the chat box and I can say them for you. So without further ado, we'll go around the panelists and they'll give a brief intro about themselves. If you'd like to go first, Meghan.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, or I guess good evening over on the East Coast. I'm Meghan Higgins. I am our Political, Economic, and Public Affairs Officer here at the U.S. Consulate in Perth. I also would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm dialing in from today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Just very quickly, a little bit about myself. I have been in our foreign service for roughly 6 years. I, prior to joining the foreign service, worked as a lobbyist on energy and environmental policy in DC, and before that worked on Capitol Hill in the United States Senate. And I did my master's degree in ethnic conflict at Queen's University in Belfast in Northern Ireland, focusing on the role of the arts in ethnically divided societies. Once I joined the Foreign Service, my first tour was as a political officer working in Timor-Leste, so just north of Australia. And then I went and learned Arabic and served as a consular officer in Baghdad, Iraq. I've been in Australia for about 2 years. And I also wanted to thank my colleagues at the consulate in Sydney for inviting me to participate today.
Thank you so much, Meghan. And what about you, Donald?
Hi, everyone. I'm Donald Maynard. I'm the head of public affairs here at the United States Consulate in Sydney, Australia. Been here for coming up on just about 3 years. Been a foreign service officer for just under 16 years. This was a second career for me, or is a second career for me. Before joining the U.S. Foreign Service, I worked in a range of civil society organizations, nonprofits in the United Kingdom and in the United States. Let's see, I started out my career in the Foreign Service in Brasilia, where I did consular work. That's doing visa interviews. All of the US diplomats, part of our requirements for our job is that we start our career in the consular section at an embassy or at a consulate, regardless of whether we're going to move on into other areas or stay in the consular section. After that, I went to Baghdad, where I served in the political section at our embassy in 2008. After Baghdad, I went to London and worked there for a couple of years, then on to New Delhi. And because I don't learn very easily or very well, I went back to Baghdad for a second tour where I worked as the deputy press attaché. And then I went on to our delegation to UNESCO in Paris, where I was the head of public affairs, and then here. Let me throw in, and Emma, thank you so much for the introduction, just a couple of other notes about Chat with the Diplomat. Meghan and I come here to talk about what you're interested in talking about. If you don't ask questions, then we'll talk about what we're interested in talking about, which won't be as interesting. We will try our best to answer any and all questions. There's no real ground rules here, except that we won't talk about the United States election, and that's not because either of us are shy. It's not because either of us don't have ideas or thoughts or personal opinions. It's because there is a law in the United States, the Hatch Act it's called, which bans federal employees from being politically active. We are allowed to vote. We are allowed to support a candidate. We're allowed to contribute to a campaign if we feel like we have spare money, but we're not allowed to express publicly opinions about who should win or come second or third in an election, in a federal election. So you can ask us all you want, but hopefully we won't take the bait and get ourselves fired for talking about the election. If you want to ask about the mechanics of the election, more than happy to talk about that, the intricacies of the Electoral College, all that fun stuff. Happy to talk about, but not about the politicians or their policies. And then the other promise that I'll make to you is we won't lie to you. If we don't know an answer to a question, we'll say we don't know, and we'll try to get back to you. This isn't a space for us to try to spin and make up answers. We've got a fairly small group tonight, so we should be able to get a lot of back and forth dialogue, and that's really what I'm looking forward to. I always think it's a shame when we have 60 or 70 people at an event and 8 people get to ask questions. So tonight, everybody should be able to be heard. I think that is about it. So Emma,
Beautiful.
Back to you.
Well, thank you for that. So yeah, we did have quite a few questions come in when people registered. A lot of them were centered towards career paths. So I'll start with those ones. But I had a lot of questions in regards to building a career in diplomacy. I had an attendee, her name's Amy, and she asked, what do you wish you knew when you were starting your career in diplomacy, and what would you have done differently?
Meghan, go ahead.
I'll jump in. Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. So this one was submitted in advance. And so Donald and I actually talked about this one earlier today, because this is a really hard question. And Donald, I'm going to save your analogies so that you can use it. But everything that you do in this career sort of either opens up another pathway or closes a pathway. And so since joining the Foreign Service, if I had changed any of the decisions that I made, I wouldn't be here today. And it's unclear sort of where you would end up being. So I think, one of the key things we say in the Foreign Service is that you just have to be flexible and adaptable. And I think, you learn that lesson sort of the hard way sometimes. And so sort of really understanding what that means early on, I think saves a little bit of heartache. But I don't think that I would go back and change anything, because every single experience, whether it was amazingly positive or whether it was really challenging, has led me to where I am, and changing any of them is sort of like the butterfly effect. You don't know where you'd end up.
That's true.
Yeah, and I would agree with Meghan on that. Sorry, Emma, I interrupted you, but I would agree with Meghan, and it's very difficult. So when we start our careers, we all start in an orientation class, and it's called A100. And it's called the A100 because sometime back in the 70s or something, the new officer orientation class was in room A100 at the State Department. So it's called A100. Now, I don't know about you, Megan, but in my class, and there was about 94 of us, and there were people sitting there on the first day plotting out their route to become an ambassador. It's like, I'm going to take my first job doing consular affairs in Mexico City, and then I'm going to come back and work in the ops center. And the ops center is like our sort of situation room at the State Department, where they deal with with current emergencies and what's going on around the world. And Prime Minister Morrison wants to talk to the Secretary of State. How do we get the call through and all that stuff? And then I'm going to go and do this job and that job, and then I'll get promoted, and then I'll get promoted, and then I will be an ambassador in 20 years. I didn't come in, like I said, I came in mid-career. I was in my 40s when I joined the State Department, so I had no fantasies of that. So my little grid that I was jotting down, thank God with pencil, not pen, was where do I want to be and what do I want to do? And so that's what I've used to guide my career. But if there was anything I would change, I think not a whole lot, but I think I would try to be a little bit less earnest at the beginning of my career, and a little bit less, I'm going to fix the world, because now I am the United States government. Like any job, you have to be patient and you have to build. And a lot of my colleagues and I come in that first couple of years, and like, we're raring to go. And sometimes you have to be raring to learn and take a deep breath. And so maybe that's what I would have changed, is not been so earnest.
Fair. And I guess this question that comes up, it kind of goes off from that. We had Dylan who asked, what advice would you give to your younger self to prepare for a career in diplomacy?
I think, Donald, I can jump in.
Yeah, you start out, yeah.
I would say maybe I'm a little non-traditional in this one, but I would say don't prepare for a career in diplomacy, do what you love. And so whether that path is the traditional international relations and studying foreign languages and learning all that, fantastic. My path was not that. So I went to college wanting to be a theater major. I think there's a lot of skills that I learned doing stage management and technical theater in terms of event planning, but also just how to be nimble and think on your feet. And you don't have a lot of time in front of an audience to really change your mind and change directions. And so how to actually come up with a plan and see it through to the end. And then I went and worked in DC for a really long time, working on energy and environmental policy. And it wasn't until, like Donald, it's my second career, it wasn't until much later. And so I would say, if you do what you love, you'll eventually land where you want to land. But if you try to push it through, I think that's when you set yourself up for being frustrated in terms of your career path and where you land. So do what you want to do what you love, and it will all work out in the end.
I wish I had been serious about studying foreign languages before I joined the State Department. I was a very, very lazy student, and sort of studied Spanish and never got past menu, restaurant Spanish. One of the beautiful things about the United States Foreign Service is that they teach us languages. Our Foreign Service Institute teaches more than 90 languages, and if you're going to a job that is what we refer to as language designated, you get the time to study that language. Spanish is 6 months. The full Arabic course is 2 years. Russian is 2 years. That's your full-time job for 2 years, is to spend 5 hours a day in a classroom studying Arabic, and then do about 3 or 4 hours of homework, and you take your salary, and you're not expected to do anything other than learn your language. Sounds beautiful, doesn't it? It is it's the most painful thing in the world.
It is so intense.
There's no high, you're in a classroom of 4 people at a maximum. And, when I was taking Spanish in high school, I was in a class of 30 people. There's plenty of space to hide in a room of 30.
Yeah.
In a room of 4, there is no place to hide.
It's like being in high school all over again.
Oh, And we, one thing that you'll find with diplomats, and I don't think this is exclusive to American diplomats, is there's no shortage of ego.
Mhm.
And most of the people that make it in did fairly well in school and at university. And you go from being, a highly educated professional diplomat to a 10-year-old in a classroom. And it is really hard on the ego to get in there and not be the best and not to charge forward. So I wish I had taken language studies seriously.
Okay, well, moving on from childhood trauma, I'll take you to a question that was sent through by Sarah, who asked, how important is the US military alliance with Australia for its security and defense strategies in the South China Sea? So quite a specific one.
Yeah, shall I start out with that one, Megan? Okay, so first of all, the military alliance, well, the alliance writ large, but this question drills down to the military relationship between our two countries is hugely important. In fact, I wish I knew how to quickly throw things up on screen. I could show you me taking your prime minister out to the Ronald Reagan, out the aircraft carrier, out in the middle of the Coral Sea, and that was during exercise Talisman Sabre last year. So every other year, we run a military exercise with Australia off the coast, mostly off the coast of Queensland, where there's something like 35,000 personnel between the two countries taking part in these exercises. And it is all about the United States and Australia being interoperable in terms of our military affairs and being able to work together, collaborate, cooperate. There's something like 200 US military officers that are posted here at various installations around Australia, and a similar number of Australians in the United States. Australia is a Five Eyes member, so we share intelligence in two directions with Australia at levels that aren't seen anywhere else around the world. So it is a very sincere, and it goes beyond South China Sea. Our military alliance is as close as we have with any country in the world, and some would argue the closest that we have in terms of information sharing. So it's a real backbone of our relationship between the two countries.
I would just echo everything that Donald said, and also say specifically out here in Western Australia, we have personnel embedded in several commands, including HMAS Sterling, where we've got submariners, again, working on interoperability between our two submariner forces. And so we've had several submarines come in, which is really exciting because we can take folks out on visits to see them. But the fundamental, at the core of the relationship, is this idea that we trust each other, we share information, we share the same values, and so we're able to really work together quite well. And this is maybe a little bit outside the military scope, but involvement in it. One really clear example of how our alliance is realized is, I don't know if anyone remembers last year when a US citizen and an Australian citizen, Kevin King and Tim Weeks, were held by the Taliban, and our two countries worked very closely together to secure their release. So in addition to, we go to battlefields together, we share intelligence, we also bring our citizens home together. And that's one of, I think, the most symbolic examples of where our alliance really, at the end of the day, works for our people. They were teachers working in Afghanistan who were kidnapped, and working together, we were able to bring them both home.
Yeah. And that's Australia and the US has always said that their relationship is so strong and such a special relationship and always been highly valued. So yeah, that's a great question. Now we've got Jessica, who just submitted a question saying that she's studying a master's of international relations, and it was towards Meghan. So she wanted to ask, how did your studies with arts and ethnography contribute to your diplomatic career?
That's a really good question. Like I said, I took a little bit of a winding path, but I think my interest has always been in people and culture, and diplomacy is a really good way to pull that together. And so I worked on politics in the US for a really long time. I'm a political officer in the State Department But in my current role, I'm also our public affairs officer. And so this was a real opportunity for me to be able to take all the things I love, the maneuvering of politics, how people interact with each other, how people's minds work and how their cultures, whether they are narratives that they've created for themselves or their stories that have been told throughout generations, how that impacts the way people behave, and then use it to help advance some of our goals of democracy and a free and open Indo-Pacific. So I would say it's sort of that interest of people that drove me to get that type of master's degree, which is the same interest that drove me into the Foreign Service.
And then my following question is for both, but it was because you worked in different locations in different countries with different cultures. The question was, in your time as a political officer in Timor-Leste, Baghdad, and Iraq, how did you adapt to new cultures, places, and languages? And what challenges did you face, and how did you overcome them?
Sure, that's a really good question. So I have found that when I live in countries where I expect there to be vast cultural differences. So Timor-Leste, I didn't speak the language when I arrived. I learned it in country. Baghdad, I was taught some of the language, but you expect there to be vast cultural differences. You're sort of used to them. Surprisingly, I think I had a harder time in Australia because I expected it to be so similar. And there were these little things that were different that always just threw me for a huge loop. But I would say one of my rules when I go to another country is for the first 3 months, you have to say yes to every invitation you receive, because that's the way you get to meet people and that's the way you really get to understand the culture that you're in. And through that, I have been lucky to just make some incredible friends who've taken me under their wings and really explained those cultural differences that maybe you don't always understand in the beginning and can get yourself into a little bit of hot water around. And I probably have lifelong friends from my time in Timor and from my time in Iraq who I would do anything for, and I know they would do the same for me. So I think it's that sort of open mind, the knowing that life is totally different than what you expected. And then just sort of, again, being flexible and adaptable. And then also recognizing that culture shock is real. And so there are times that you need to just sort of sit back, read a good book, be under your comforter and just give yourself that sort of self-love to get through the next day.
Yeah, definitely. And what about for you, Donald?
Well, it's funny you should talk about culture shock, Megan. Other than studying languages, so I studied French with limited amounts of success, and then I've had vacations back in the States, but I've lived outside of the States since 2006. And what I find is I'm now experiencing serious culture shock when I go back to the US.
Yeah.
And in fact, Megan and I, by law, so we don't have a choice in this, by law, when we transfer from one country to another, we have to go back for what's referred to as home leave. And it's extra annual leave that we're granted, but by an act of Congress, we have to spend that time in the United States. Now, it's sort of an antiquated law. It was set up when, US diplomats literally got on a steamship and would go off to, China or wherever and be there for 8-10 years. And there was they lost contact with the US. There was, you waited for a 10-week-old New York Times to show up to read about what's happening back home. Now it's much more easy with the internet, with Zoom and all this fun stuff to stay in touch with friends and culture. I know what my baseball team did last night, but it is still a bit of culture shock when you go back to the United States. And weird little things like Australia does not have a tipping culture. Tipping, I mean, as in giving your bartender, waitress, waiter extra money after a meal. In the United States, it's very much part of our culture that you provide a tip at the end of service. And you have to sort of remind yourself after you've been here for 3 years that, that waitress is earning $2 an hour in the United States. It's not charity, it's their wage for you to give them a 20% tip at the end of your meal. And it takes a minute to remember. Now, I know the other side of that coin is Australian bartenders love it when they hear an American accent because they think I'm going to hand over $10 at the end. And I have to remind them I've been here for a while, and I know they're getting paid what they're getting paid. Yeah, the culture shock is real, and actually, I'll probably segue into something. I saw Ashley just asked a question that sort of spins off of this.
Yeah.
Where Ashley Woods asks us, how do you manage the stress of representing your country in parts of the world that may not have the best relationship with the United States? I actually find it easier to do my job in those sorts of countries because you know what the challenge is and you confront it, and you know that they don't like this piece of our policy, and you present this piece of our policy and you explain it, and it's pretty easy. Now, when you're in countries like here or the United Kingdom, where I've also served, where we're in pretty close alignment on a lot of our foreign policy priorities, we're just sort of nibbling around the edges. And we're just, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is trying to convince us to shift 2% on a policy, and we're trying to convince them to shift 1.5% on another policy. I find that actually more challenging. I find if you're in an argument with somebody, you know exactly what you want to say. If you agree mostly with somebody, you have to, there's more nuance that's required. So I don't know, Megan, what do you think? You've been in a couple of different places.
I think that you explained it really well. I think that when you have victories in those more challenging assignments, they're big victories. And I think in countries where we're aligned, it's harder to have those sort of big celebratory victories because it really is just nudging everything forward and keeping the relationship together and making sure that everyone's happy. But when you do something that really advances a policy or really helps someone in some of those more challenging environments, you really feel it. And that really boosts your morale and your ability to sort of start on the next challenge. And so in some ways it's harder, but in some ways it's also just so incredibly rewarding that it keeps you going.
Definitely. And I guess this also just a question came in, which kind of goes into what you guys were saying, which I hope I'm saying your name right, Athelia, I think it was pronounced. But they're asking, what is your proudest moment through your diplomatic career, or which moment, achievement would you want to relive?
Ooh, that's interesting. Megan, have you got a proud moment?
I do. I actually have a couple, but I'll do two really quickly, Donald. That'll give you some time to think. So when I was in Timor-Leste, we, at the time when I got there, we didn't have a consular team. And so we did not issue visas there, which made it really challenging for the Timorese who wanted to travel to the United States. They had to go to Jakarta and spend all of that money to stay in Jakarta for a week while their visa was processed, and there's no guarantee that you're going to get the visa. And I was approached by the Timorese Special Olympics team with this challenge of, we've got these 20 Special Olympic athletes that want to go compete in the United States, but we cannot afford to send them to Jakarta. And through a lot of, collaborative ally building throughout the department, we eventually came up with a plan to bring in someone from Fiji who had a laptop who could do the interviews. And to make the long story short, we managed to get everyone their interviews, and we sent this amazing consular staff from Fiji back on her way, and a volcano erupted in Bali and she got stuck there. And then our consular systems had a global meltdown for a week. And we were literally on our last moments to be able to get these passports, which were now sitting in Fiji, back to the team in Timor-Leste to get them to the US. And I jumped on a plane and flew from Dili to Fiji, which there is no direct route, stayed in Fiji for about 2 hours, picked up the passports and flew all the way back and handed the team their passports the day before their flight. And they won 5 gold medals at the Special Olympics. And so that is probably my sort of proudest moment, where I was literally a cog in the wheel. I didn't do anything amazing except for do my job. I think my other real quick proudest moment was, again, helping an American citizen who had been brought into ISIS territory in Syria by her parents when she was 9 years old. She was married off to an ISIS fighter. By the time I got connected to her, she was 15 and pregnant and a widow. And we were trying to get her back to the United States, and getting a letter from her grandparents months later with a picture of a healthy baby. Again, I had very little to do other than being a cog in the bureaucratic wheel of getting that done. But those two are probably my proudest Foreign Service moments.
Those are beautiful achievements.
And tough to top.
Good luck.
Yeah. Proudest, I mean, we all have very quirky, weird stories that we can tell about our careers. But I think one of the hardest pieces of work that I took part in was in 2008, and this was in Iraq. And the Iraqi people were going to have their first provincial elections since 2003. So provinces think like Australian states. So it's as though, you know, Queensland just started their election today. It's as though every state in Australia was going to have their state elections at the same time. And you're all going to do it with an entirely new electoral system that had just been written into the Constitution 6 months ago. So brand new Constitution. And now all of the parties, many of the parties which didn't exist 6 months ago, are going to run candidates. And I was working at that time at our embassy for what's referred to as our Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. So we had grants out with nonprofit organizations in Iraq to work with the parliament and to work with the parties. We were doing everything from training politicians on how to run a democratic campaign, how to talk to their constituents, how to do television interviews. We had mock studios where they could come in and practice doing interviews. But my job was to understand the electoral system, how it was supposed to work, and then to fly around to cities around Iraq and explain to people how this new electoral system was going to work, and to hope that I wasn't killed while I was doing that, and even more importantly, to hope that there was no violence on the day. Yeah. The elections were months late in happening, but fortunately they happened before I departed the country. We had election observers out at polling places all around the country, and the elections did happen. There was no significant violence. It was actually one of the least violent days that Iraq had experienced, and this was in early 2009 by the time of the election. And because I had done all of these briefings, I got the job of sitting at the embassy and collecting all of the information from the poll watchers. So I had people calling me and sending in emails and things like that from all over the country, and I had to write, in diplomatic terms, we refer to it as a cable. Now it's just a glorified email, but it's a very strictly formatted official communication back to Washington of what happened that day. And that is probably the only time ever in my career that I knew what I was writing was going to be read within minutes of me hitting send by the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, you know, and you take a moment before you hit send on that, because you really don't want to have a mistake in there.
No typos, please.
Yeah, well, trust me, we have, so in our system, you know, everything gets what we refer to as cleared. So those documents get cleared by like a dozen people. But because this was so important, the people clearing were literally looking over my shoulder while I'm typing, because they want to get it out fast. Yeah. And it's sort of a heady moment. I mean, you know, you have many heady moments in this career. One is like the first time you raise your hand and take the oath. The other is the first time you're at a July 4th celebration overseas and you hear our national anthem. And you know, that moment when you know that you're writing to the president and the vice president and the secretary of state and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and it's humbling and scary as hell. Yeah.
I feel like in that moment, like my brain would just under stress would be like, I forgot how to spell. I don't even know how to write English anymore. I'm done. But I guess this kind of goes off on my next question that I want to ask you guys. I'm sure everybody that's attending has probably wondered this at some point, but the question is, what is the typical day of a diplomat like? Like, I think that my idea of what a diplomat is like on their typical day is just like, so extravagant. So I want to know, like, because what you guys just explained is very insane and like exactly feeds into the reality that I believe. But what is it actually like on a day to day?
So I'm going to let you start, Megan, because I'm reading this bizarre note from our friend Dan Illich.
I think that's the cable that you drafted.
Was that it? Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll talk, Dan. We'll put you on for a question in a minute, but Megan, you go ahead with the
That's your
answer.
cable. So a typical day. First, can I just add to Donald's list of hitting moments? The first time you drive in a vehicle with the ambassador and the American flag is flying on the vehicle and you're driving through town, you just have this moment where you're like, how did I get here? In a really positive and really cool way. So I would say, if you've watched Homeland or any of those movies, that is not my life. Or TV shows, that's not my life at all. So I have a, by and large, typical desk job. I come into the consulate in the morning, usually with my cup of coffee. I have meetings. We do research and writing. We prep for, press talking points. We plan trips for the consul general. We're traveling in the coming months, and so I'm trying to schedule those meetings now. We do high school outreach, so I go and talk to local high schools here about why the US and Australia alliance matters. And did I mention meetings? I've got lots of meetings and conference calls. And on occasion, we have the sort of really cool drafted for a movie type of situation. But day to day, I would say it's sort of your average desk job, but with the exception that you meet really incredible people nearly every day. Whether it's today, I had lunch with some marine scientists folks here. Last week we did a lunch with a bunch of community groups. And so every day I get to meet really cool people. But Donald, you can try to make our job sound more exciting than I did.
So day in the life. So when I was in Paris, working at our delegation to UNESCO, and we were on what's called the executive board of UNESCO. It's 58 members of the 194 member states of UNESCO. And we sit in a big circle, very, very UN-ish, in a big circle. And because we're placed in the circle according to the name of our country in alphabetical order by the French alphabet, not the English alphabet, because French is the language of diplomacy, we sat next door to our friends from the Russian Federation. So literally, when I was, usually our ambassador would be in the chair, but often I would be asked to sit in the chair during debates, or if it was an issue that I was the lead on, I would be there for the debate. And if I was sitting there, usually that meant the Russian deputy would be there and not the Russian ambassador. And at one point during a particularly tedious debate, she reached over to me and she said, "So tell me the truth," and I'm not going to try to do a Russian accent, but tell me the truth. Is your government really run like House of Cards? And then I turned around to her, and I don't know if you guys get to watch this show here in Australia, but I said, no, it's actually more like Veep. If you've ever seen the show Veep with Julie Marie-Dreyfus, she was from Seinfeld, you would enjoy that. You should watch that. So we do have a lot of routine. You know, I sit there and I do HR issues. I talk to colleagues and staff. We have debates with people about how we should spend our budget. And then, as Megan said, every so often, something like the Secretary of State is coming to the country and wants me to organize a speech in the State Library of New South Wales, where we have to hire a sound and technology firm to come in and clear out all the books and set it up. And we have 17 television cameras back there. I did one with Michelle Obama when she was the First Lady at Oxford University, where we brought in a group of young students from the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson School, that's an all-girls school in central London, who didn't know who they were going to meet that day. So to set the scene, we're in the hall that they use for the filming of the dinner scenes in Harry Potter films.
Yeah.
And while we were negotiating with Oxford to use the hall, we told them, well, we have to do our security sweep, and so we'll need the room from 9 a.m. They said, but the students eat here at noon every day. We said, well, it's not going to work today. They said, no, they've done it every day since Henry VIII was on the throne.
It's not going to stop today.
They did. They did. They stopped. So we took over the hall, and all right, this was like one of my best moments and most horrifying moments was when Michelle Obama went out onto the stage and she began to talk and nobody could hear her because the very good staff in the green room had turned off her lapel mic so we wouldn't hear them in the green room, but they didn't turn it back on. And so if you Google this and look it up on YouTube, you can see her starting to talk and nobody can hear. And you hear these like footfalls, and that's me walking up the center aisle with a remote microphone. And you see this hand sort of come in and handed the microphone. So that was, but yeah, like Megan said, 90% of the job is routine. It's writing, it's reading. I will say one of the best things about this job, though, is I've always been a voracious consumer of the news. And it was so nice on my first day to be told it is your job to consume the news and to not feel guilty about reading 4 newspapers a day and watching the news and things like that.
Or social media. I am a social media consumer. Like Twitter is my place. And so the fact that I can say that it's work related when I scroll through Twitter for 30 minutes before I go to sleep is amazing.
This is my job. So great. I have another question, probably one of the last questions, but I had one question by Jessica who says, how has the consular activities changed since COVID and the travel bans?
So Jessica, are you talking about just the activities of the consulate, like Megan's and my work? Or are you talking about consulate? Well, I guess we could talk about both. You know, in terms of our visa work, there's been a real hiccup in doing visa interviews because of all the restrictions for travel and the frustrations that I understand of Australians who have been waiting to apply for a visa, although most of them couldn't travel to the United States right now. So that's been seriously affected, but we're getting back into the flow with the visa work. But the other things that have really changed is the last year we had more visitors, official visitors from the United States government in Australia than we had had in any single year since the Second World War. So that meant that I rarely went more than 2 weeks without having a congressional delegation or the Secretary of State or a Deputy Assistant Secretary or Assistant Secretary or the Administrator of USAID come through and want us to put together a program for them to go visit the Lowy Institute or a university group or a Macquarie Bank. And this year, no visitors. Zero visitors. And what's also changed is our engagements with the public. We're doing it through Zoom instead of sitting at a university, which has had its pluses, but I really do miss the personal interaction. Megan?
I agree with everything you said. I would say Western Australia has been lucky in terms of the restrictions got lifted here fairly early. And so we only have some minor restrictions other than the border. And so we have been able to start doing some really small group stuff again. But like everyone else, we, for a while we were shut down, we were working from home. And it's only been in the last month or so that we've been able to get out more and do some traveling and try to go back to business as usual. I will say, I think one of the really cool things that we have embraced is being able to do more virtual programs, which allows us to get out to regional areas and bring people on to see the work that we do that maybe we wouldn't necessarily engage with. So I think that there's some silver linings and some adoption of technology that I think will be really helpful as we continue.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of hard to know if things are going to go back to normal or if this is our new normal, like trying to adapt. We just had a question before as well that was just asking quickly, does dual citizenship affect your capability of becoming a diplomat? So do you need to have like US citizen, American citizenship, and then if you have, let's say, like Australian, do you have to get rid of your Australian one?
Donald, I can try to jump in here and you can correct me if I'm wrong. We have a pretty standard joke in the United States Foreign Service that the answer to every question is, it depends. And so I think that's pretty much a clear one of it depends. It depends on a lot of factors, and diplomatic security makes the final adjudication on whether or not you qualify for your clearances. But with that, I'll say I do know Foreign Service officers who are dual nationals, so it's definitely not a no. But I couldn't, say from this country yes, from this country no. It's all about a variety of specifics and individual situations.
Yeah, so it's on a base to base. So yeah, seeming we don't have any other questions, we'll probably wrap up our webinar now as well. But thank you guys so much for joining me and being part of all of this, and everybody that attended as well. I hope we answered all of the questions that you had and that you had a good time. Now, before we finalize the webinar as well, there'll be a survey that'll pop up when you log off the webinar. So please take time to fill out the survey so we can keep on improving. The US Consulate General Sydney is having another virtual event on Friday the 9th on influencing the narrative, how the Chinese government mobilizes students and media to burnish its image, which is linked to register in the text box, which you'll be able to access. And the YDS is also having an event tomorrow with Gareth Evans. So if you want to find out more about that, you can head to the YDS website, which is Young Diplomats Society, on any of their social medias as well. But yeah, again, thank you guys so much for everybody that attended. I had such a good time, and thank you again.
Thank you for moderating, and thanks everyone for your fantastic questions.
Thank you.